Well, welcome, everyone. I'd like to talk to you today. Actually, I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about marshes and the people who take care of marshes. And I'm going to start the story right now with pretending we're standing in the middle of a salt marsh, and that will be a little bit easier if I move to the marsh. So I want to think you to think about the salt marshes in the state of Maine. 22,000 acres of salt marsh, and every day the tide comes in, the tide goes out, and those marshes are taking care of you. They're providing you with food, they're filtering your water, and they are protecting you from storms. So the story I'm going to tell today is about the people who take care of those marshes, who are taking care of us. So I have two jobs that have enabled me to stay close to salt marshes. One of them was at the University of New England, where I taught for 20 years. I taught in the environmental studies department, and I figure I've talked to about between 2,000 and 3,000 students in those 20 years of teaching. And the students that were in my first class are now 44 years old. Now, one thing that would happen in that university class, in the Intro to Environmental Issues class, we would talk about pollution, we talk about habitat loss, we talk about degradation of the environment. And sometimes toward the end of the semester, the students would look at me and say, why hasn't anybody ever told us this stuff until now? And they'd be really down and really depressed. And I'd say, listen, literally every single thing we've talked about in this class, thousands of people are working on solving that right now. And to say that that is what's happening with marshes in Maine, I'm going to tell you about some of those people who are protecting marshes in Maine. Now, my love affair with marshes started in a way that you might be surprised about. It's when I was an undergraduate at the University of Maryland. I was studying zoology, and because my parents said I would never get a job if I studied nature, I was in zoology to study medical things. But that summer, when I was a junior, we went to Assateague Island, Virginia. My father was literally a rocket scientist. He invented the first satellite shot into space by America when he was 23 years old. So Dad's rockets were going to be launched from Wallops Island, which is right across from Assateague. So we loaded up the car and stood on the beach at Assateague and watched the rockets take off. As we were leaving Assateague, I said, it's a pretty nice place, pretty beautiful. I wouldn't mind working here. And they had an ad for a summer job. So that summer, I came back to Assateague Island and the Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge and started a job as a tour guide, as a naturalist. And that was the first transformation. There was no way I was going to spend the rest of my life in a lab analyzing medical samples. I was going to spend the rest of my life in the marsh or on the beach, either one, and studying the environment. So I went back to school, I started changing some of my courses, and then I came back in the summers and continued working on the coast of Virginia for about 10 years. But this was the phase where my primary relationship with marshes was as an educator. I was telling people about marshes, just like I am right now. I had to learn about marshes because even though I'd been going to the beach my whole life, I didn't spend that much time in the marsh. And I learned about their productivity, their longevity, how they contribute to the health and well-being of people. I also learned a lot about barrier island ecology, barrier island geomorphology. This is the coast of Virginia, which the furthest north island is Assateague Island. It's 33 miles long. That's where I worked most of this period of time. But about 4 islands down is another island I'll tell you about called Cedar Island, where I did my master's research. These Virginia barrier islands are like just a string of pearls along the coast. And most of the East Coast has barrier islands like this or barrier beaches. There's barrier beaches here in Maine, and it's behind the sandy island that the beaches grow, that the marshes grow in the green lagoons on the backside. Now, you see geologists here in the audience, so forgive me, this is a crash course in barrier island geomorphology, very simplified. This is something you have to know about barrier islands and marshes. It's kind of a zonation or a cross section. And normally you don't have to know super a lot, but you have to know the oceans on one side, then the beach, everybody knows this. And then as you move inland, you might get to an inner dune meadow, and then maybe a maritime forest with shrubs. The further you get from the ocean, the more robust the vegetation can be, trees and shrubs that don't like salt water. Then when you get to the back of a barrier island, that's where the marshes grow and thrive. So a couple things to remember, the marshes are on the back side, they're not on the ocean side, and the trees are back toward the middle. The trees are not in the ocean, and this will come up later. So no trees in the ocean, no salt marshes in the ocean. Remember that. Now, things that shape the coast are not just the daily tides and winds, there are storms. Now, I kind of adapted this talk a little bit after the storms that we had here in Maine. There's a very famous storm that hit in the mid-Atlantic called the Ash Wednesday storm of 1962. Not only did it wreak havoc for communities and for islands and beaches, it's something that changed the course of Assateague Island. So sometimes, of course, storms always affect people, but sometimes they have bigger impacts. Before this storm, Assateague Island had been subdivided into 4,000 house lots and was being marketed in the DC area. This is about a couple hours from Washington, DC. The street signs were up, the roads were marked, and the Ash Wednesday storm hit. By 1965, 3 years later, Assateague Island National Seashore was created, and the land was protected into the future. So the storm had a negative effect, but it also had an effect that prevented future harm from people that could have been living out there. And thousands of people can still enjoy the benefits of the marsh and the beach. And there was no one was kicked off the island. The development hadn't happened yet. So in this case, the storm had an effect on the island. After I finished my degree, I got a job at what was then called the Wallops Island Marine Science Center. It's now called the Chincoteague Bay Field Station. This was created on the mainland opposite Assateague Island by all the colleges in Pennsylvania that don't have any ocean. So they made this field station so they could bring their students down to the ocean. And I worked there for 2 years, still as an educator. Here we are out in the marsh. 1 second to find me. Okay, time's up. Then I'm beginning my next phase of my relationship with marshes, which was as a marsh researcher. So I'm still doing my education, working at the Park Service, teaching at the Marine Lab, and I started studying barrier island overwash. Now, overwash is kind of intuitive. You might know what it means. It's when a storm hits, you see those fans of sand coming back from the beach? Those are overwash fans. There'd been a lot of work. This was back in the 70s, before there was internet. A lot of people at Cape Cod were working on overwash processes, and there was a group working in North Carolina on overwash processes, but nobody was really looking at it in the Virginia coast. And I wanted to look at plants and their adaptation to overwash, specifically the marsh. So I started working on Cedar Island and worked for a couple of years in between going back and forth to still being a marsh educator. Here's a picture of Cedar Island, one of the long, skinny islands. It's near Wachapreague, Virginia, in the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. And I was a student at the College of William and Mary for my master's. Now, when I first started exploring the island, I noticed these features. That is the remnant of a telephone pole from the previous development on the island. And see those black structures in the surf? A little bit closer. That is marsh peat filled with ribbed mussels. So remember where I said the marshes is a marsh in the ocean, the marsh is on the back of the island. So even without a special degree in coastal geomorphology, this tells you that at one point, that marsh in the surf was on the back side of the island. And the beach and the ocean were in front of it. So one of the responses to marshes to sea level rise is for them to transgress or migrate landward. The pressure of sea level rise causes the overwash, and it kind of moves the island backwards. It helps the island maintain its height and elevation. It builds new marshes, and the island survives by moving. Again, no trees in the surf, no marsh in the surf, they're on the backside. If you just move the whole island back and the marsh appears in the front, you've seen the island still exists, it's just moved. We have this kind of evidence in Maine as well. This is a cedar tree stump at the Wells Reserve in the salt marsh. And you could walk on the beach at the Wells Reserve in the summer and see marsh peat in the ocean. So Drake's Island used to be further east, and the marsh behind it has now come out in the front. So here's Cedar Island in 1959. Huge inlet opened in 1962. And I was looking at the vegetation response to this and learning about these dynamic systems. Oops, I'm gonna give away a story. Okay, so when I finished this master's research and understood about barrier islands and their dynamic nature and all this changing, I said, oh my God, as soon as everybody finds this out, they're gonna stop building in these coastal areas. Yeah, I was in my 20s, I thought, because this is amazing. If everybody knew this, if everybody knew what I just found out about barrier islands, nobody would ever put a house on a barrier island because the whole island would literally move out from under them. So in the decade after I finished my master's research, about 14 houses were built on Cedar Island. The island had been previously subdivided into about 2,000 lots, and that had been abandoned. But then they were marketed again in the 1980s for people that wanted an experience away from civilization. And one by one, finally by 2013, the last house fell into the sea. The people that owned that last house were good enough to, they burned the house down, they took the septic system out, they took all the pieces of the house before the ocean claimed it. But other people just abandoned their houses and they fell into the sea. So that brings me to the final transformation. And it has to do with ecology. By this time, I'm living in Maine, and I decided just for fun, in addition to my 2 jobs, I want to get a PhD. So I'm working at the Wells Reserve, I'm teaching at UNE, and I'm getting a PhD. But with my PhD, I wanted to understand that fact that we have all this science and people are still building houses on barrier islands. Super naive, and I know that you guys, especially here, know that's very complex. But this evolution of thinking in ecology, in 1971, a man nicknamed Buzz Holling wrote the first paper using the word resilience. So that was 1971. Last week, I was watching one of the news stories about the storm, and I heard a regular person talking about the need for resilience on the news in response to our storm. So that's more than 50 years for a concept to get from science, from the literature, into the 6 o'clock news. And it's a really important concept. So what can we do to speed up that application of science to help protect marshes and communities? Here's one definition of resilience. One thing I do in my work, when we have a word like resilience and we're working with a group, the first thing we do is get everybody's definition of that out on the table so we can talk about what it means to us. And here's one. Resilience is the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events. Well, this is meaning a lot of different things to people in Maine right now as well, because of our recent storm. My work at the Wells Reserve coincided with when I was getting my PhD. And one of the only ways I could have the 2 jobs and work on the PhD is I literally studied my job. So the mission of the National Estuarine Research Reserve System is resilient estuaries and coastal watersheds where humans and natural communities thrive. That's the guiding goal of all of the National Estuarine Research Reserves. There are 30 National Estuarine Research Reserves. The Wells Reserve is the only one in Maine. And we are accompanied by all the others on the map here. Most recently, Hawaii was added. And the program I work with, called the Coastal Training Program, was started in 2002. And I've been working with that program and studying that program since I came on board. The original idea of the Coastal Training Program is if we've got a bit of science and we think it can help people make decisions that protect habitats and people, then we would deliver that science to them. So it's still that educator model, that idea of somebody's got something to say and you're going to say it. And then people are going to leave the room and they're going to do something differently. Well, what I found that it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I started studying collaborative learning, which is a whole different way of solving this problem of science moving into action. And again, I don't like to put too many words on the screen, but this is the definition of collaborative learning. I'm going to read it and then ask you to just think of each word. It's a framework and a set of techniques intended for multi-party decisions, many different people in a room. So it's a means of designing and implementing a series of events. It's never just one, to promote creative thought, constructive debate, and the effective implementation of proposals that the stakeholders generate. Easy, right? So easy. I would much rather be on an overwash ban measuring plants. It's way harder than that. But it is something that so many people could do, and many people here are doing that. So one of the first places I got to use it was a UNE project that was in collaboration with the Mitchell Center. It was about sustaining the quality of place and ecosystem health of the Saco estuary. So we worked with a team of scientists, but my part in this proposal was to work with the people who cared about the Saco estuary, the people who worked in that area. Pam Morgan studied the marshes. We also had someone studying birds. An example, this little estuary, which people up here from outside, you look down on the Saco estuary. Because we're so small, it's only 5 miles long. But in that 5 miles, 33% of all the birds in Maine use that estuary and the marshes and the uplands during the year. 60 species of fish were found in that estuary during our study. That was more species of fish than any of the other estuaries in Maine. And we have classic marsh zonation, where it's like a microcosm of the state. And the UNE students have worked to study that. So it's a pretty neat project, both to learn about the estuary and also to learn about the people who take care of it. And we made a diagram to kind of capture the fact that there's a stewardship network. Every single estuary, every single salt marsh has a stewardship network taking care of it. It's the people in the municipality, it's the land trust, it's the families that enjoy the marsh, it's the fishermen and women who harvest. There's always a network. It's never just a scientist studying the marsh. That network of stewardship is what keeps our marshes safe. There's a current project now where for undergraduates, which UNE in Biddeford is an undergraduate institution mostly, Pam has a class, Pam Morgan, called the Gulf of Maine class. And every year the students work on a new project. They recently got grant funding for this project in the marsh to test out a living shoreline on this particular marsh. So the project has continued. This is an old picture, the marsh there to the left with the curly edge. Now here's what it looks like now. That's not just high tide. There's no grass there now. So that's the marsh they're looking at for a living shoreline. Another thing that's happening in Maine, and again, this is just telling you some stories about cool things. This is a really cool project that started by Dave Burdick, Dr. Dave Burdick at UNH, and also Dr. Susan Adamovich at Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge, which is one of the primary places where marshes are cared for in southern Maine. Sue wrote a paper called Farmers in the Marsh. And I've got the citation here. You guys gotta read this, because Farmers in the Marsh, it set a whole new perspective on what's been threatening marshes. The marshes were used in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s for marsh hay. Most people know that. You get these idyllic pictures, very famous pictures of cattle grazing on the salt marsh and gigantic haystacks with marsh hay. But the thing that isn't told is that agriculture built dikes and culverts, and that stuff is still in marshes throughout New England. So this team has started working in the state of Maine with the Kennebec Estuary Project, a partnership, to look at the impact of this agricultural system in the marsh and to understand a little bit more about, we can't just keep thinking the top of the marsh is all we need to take care of. We've got to look at these old agricultural structures. And the other thing that was amazing about this paper, Farmers in the Marsh, is they made the point that in the early years of marsh ecology, the guys that published on marsh ecology described the ecology of the salt marsh without any description of this agriculture piece. And the historians never talked to the ecologists. So only relatively recently have the ecologists found the historical literature, looked at it, found the structures in the marsh, and said, oh my gosh, we're missing a big piece of protecting the marsh. The other consequence of the 1970s paper, Missing the History, was that 2 generations of salt marsh researchers weren't thinking that way when they were working in marshes. So 2 generations of salt marsh researchers attacking the problems in the marsh without attacking this. So this is another kind of cool transition, really cool paper on many levels about protecting marshes. And this team is working in Maine now. We're going to be having a session at the Maine Sustainability and Water Conference called Marshes for Maine's Future. And 5 of the stories that I'm sharing briefly, we're going to have the real storytellers share those stories about marshes. Now, bringing it down to southern Maine, Climate Ready Coast, Southern Maine, project led by Southern Maine Regional Planning and Development in partnership with the Wells Reserve, worked to develop a regional resilience plan for the 10 communities on the ocean in southern Maine. So picture Kittery to Scarborough, that was the region of the 2-year study, and working with a very robust stakeholder network from the towns, from the land trust, from the state, to identify hotspots in the region where flooding might occur. Oh my God, you say, were you right? Because we did a vulnerability assessment, we mapped the hotspots, and then we started coming up with solutions for the different vulnerable places in southern Maine. The resilience plan, which is online, the link is here, was just released last November. And unfortunately, the places that were identified as hotspots were underwater. One of the first things that Abby Sherwin with Southern Maine Regional Planning and Development did is she sent the message back to those communities that said, if you're writing for grants, if you need help, this plan has things that you can do to recover from the storm. So it was done as an activity, as an exercise to prepare for something that happened this month. Here were kind of the stages. It was, as I said, very robust engagement with communities. There was a survey asking people what they thought the issues were, a vulnerability assessment, stakeholders engaged for the whole 2 years, identifying the hotspots, and then the group collectively said, this is where we want to start working. And one of the places that the group picked were marshes marshes that could be restored to be more robust, and future marshes, the places marshes are going to go to as the sea rises. I know the color won't come through here perfectly, but the state of Maine has already mapped these migration pathways. We know the areas in the state where marshes can move, and we've got that piece of information to help people in planning for conservation. Now, okay, time-wise, I'm good. And this is the title, Marshes for Maine's Future. This is the last story I'll tell, because it's the project we're doing right now, but it builds on the legacy of all the other projects. So the Marshes for Maine's Future project started last fall, but technically it started a little over a year ago, and I'll tell you the story about that. Not to depress a bunch of scientists, but I usually don't have much time to read scientific journal articles. I literally don't. But for some reason, an article came across my desk and I read it. It was written by Neil Ganju, who's a scientist with USGS. And as I read about his work working with sediment budgets, now I put this reference, but the paper that first caught my eye was called Marshes Are the New Beaches. So I know what that means. I used to work in a marsh and a beach, and I read it, and it was about the connection between understanding barrier island overwash and the impact of those sediments on the marsh. But as I read the paper, I could see that he was bringing a perspective that we didn't use in the National Estuarine Reserve System, because mostly the people in the reserve system are ecologists. They're not geologists. So our lens and our problem-solving lens is mostly ecology. But Neil's paper, which is oceanography, geology, and said, I don't think we're thinking this way. And I thought it would be really cool to get Neil to come and work with the reserve and these new tools, these geospatial tools, try them out and see if they can help us with our marsh decision-making. So in order to make that really happen, I first had to call Neil, who I've never met. And it was like a science geek where, oh, I read your paper. And I told him about the reserve system, which he already knew about. I said, we have a grant opportunity. We have a thing called a transfer grant that people at reserves can apply for funding just to transfer knowledge from one source to another. And that knowledge, that transfer has to also be linked to someone who wants to use it. You can't say that, oh, my researcher would like to know about Neil's work. It has to be somebody wants to use Neil's work. So I first called Neil, he said he's on board, he'd like to do it. So then I called my marsh manager friend, and I called them one by one, and I said, you know about Neil Ganju's work? I talk about it, and I said, would you be interested in helping to develop a grant where we could get Neil to come to Maine and use these tools together? So I made a few calls, and once I had like a handful of some of the leading marsh managers who said, I'm interested, we scheduled a Zoom call with Neil, talking about these geospatial tools and with these marsh managers, and talking about the idea of applying for a grant where the purpose of the grant would be for 1 year for these marsh managers to work with Neil and his team, applying these new geospatial tools in their decision-making about marshes. So we spent a few months and multiple Zoom calls. We wrote the grant together. So literally 14 of us wrote the grant, and we submitted it to the NERS Science Collaborative that funds projects that help solve management problems at the reserve system. You cannot get funding in this pool of money unless you are engaging end users, and the end users have told you, we want the science and here's why we want it. Here's what we're going to do with it. The other interesting thing about these grants is there's a role funded in every grant for someone called a collaborative lead. The collaborative lead is the one who kind of navigates that structure between somebody with the knowledge, the researcher, and the end users, and makes sure that that connection is being made. So I know that we got the grant because here I'm standing here. And even by the time we got the grant, which was June of last year, the team already started working on it. And the funding came through in October, but nobody on the grant except the reserve, because I needed money for my position. No one is getting any money for the grant. The money is for holding the workshops and managing the team in a way that they can benefit. So every single person working on this project did not ask for money because they saw that it related to their work. So one of the things about this geospatial tool, and I'm not an expert in this, I knew enough to recognize when I read it that it could help marsh managers protect marshes in Maine. But Neil uses this technique of a geo-narrative, and at this particular link, you can read about all of the tools. He's with the Woods Hole Coastal and Marine Group. And one of the things that's hard about marshes is one way to measure how high a marsh is and how long it's going to survive with sea level rise are these set tables. And literally, that's how you take the measurements. See those little pins? You drop them in and we do like a meter square. Okay, there's 22,000 acres of marshes in Maine. And if this was the only way we could assess how long a marsh is going to last, you know, you can make judgments from that. The geospatial tools use LiDAR and other magical parts of GIS to create a picture of the marsh that will tell you, and they have something called the coastal change likelihood that you can use to predict how long a marsh might last. So here's what the two tools are called. One is called the Restoration Decision Matrix. That's what's in the paper at the beginning. The paper in the beginning just came out this month, but Neil kind of shared the paper with us as we were developing the grant, and the team on the grant has already been using it. And the Restoration Decision Matrix is based on UVVR, which is the unvegetated vegetated ratio. So if you're looking at a piece of marsh, how much of it is just bare mud flat, how much of it is grass? And also based on elevation. Because in order for a marsh to survive, it needs elevation capital. It needs that sediment that helps it keep pace with sea level rise. The second tool is called the Marsh Lifespan Calculator, where you can run using that same UVVR and other geologic information. You can calculate, hey, that particular marsh, based on this, it's going to be around for 500 years. You don't really need to do anything, but you might want to conserve it, because that marsh is going to be there serving us for a very long time. Maine is pretty lucky in that many of our marshes are a little bit high elevation compared to Chesapeake Bay, where they've been using these tools for a while. So here's the team, and they're in alphabetical order. These are the people that put together the grant, and everyone that has an asterisk, their work is going to be presented at the Maine Sustainability and Water Conference. So we've been working together since this time last year, writing the grant and now implementing it. We have knowledge sharing workshops, and we call them that because it's not just about the USGS team telling us things. It's about a dialogue among the marsh managers and researchers in Maine and the people who have created these two tools. We have our first in-person meeting next week at the Wells Reserve, where people will bring their laptops and be in the same room with Neil and Kate, his colleague, and every person on the project. All of these groups selected a case study. Because one of the best ways to learn and test something new is to apply it to real life. So every one of the marsh managers has a marsh they're working in right now, and they're going to add these two geospatial tools and see if it helps them make decisions about their project. So it's real time. The case studies on September 18th and 19th, we're going to have a capstone conference where we will share the things that these groups found in using these geospatial tools, good or bad. As Neil says, he wants to know what's not working, what does work, and then we hope to spread what we've learned even further in the state. And here's the kinds of things that the kinds of decisions these tools can help with. They can help someone identify and prioritize potential marsh conservation areas. So Kristen Purrier with the Maine Natural Areas Program for the state, if she's looking at places for conservation or for marsh migration, you can find the places with the greatest longevity. They can evaluate restoration strategies. Is that really the best place to put a living shoreline? It looks like that particular marsh doesn't have a very long lifespan. If you're going to do that, you first might want to add sediment to the marsh, increase its likelihood of surviving, and then do your treatment. It can help develop projects using nature-based solutions. Again, big expense to do nature-based solutions. You wouldn't want it to be gone in 5 years. So it's one way that can be used to look at the lifespan of a marsh. And it helps you manage wetland habitats for biodiversity. One of the big projects, the one about the agriculture, is dedicated to salt marsh sparrow habitat. So this overlaps with that as well. So what we're trying to do with our Marshes for Maine's future project, we're engaging this, what I call a kaleidoscope of expertise on marshes. You know, the kind of kaleidoscope, you hold it up to the world, and as you turn it, the world looks different. Well, people are working on marshes in many different ways. There's the geologist, there's the ecologist, there's the educator. And if you can get those people to work together in a room, you can come up with solutions that might not come up otherwise. And again, it's hard work. One of the primary things I did with this team, I calculated the number of hours they would spend on the project. There were going to be 4 workshops. There's going to be time when they practice. And I told them before they signed on. So I think this is about 176 hours in the next year that you would spend on this. So they could then say, are they in? Do they want to try it? So that was one aspect of thinking about busy practitioners and how much time would this little experiment take and would it benefit their work? So I ask you to think about kind of your work that you're doing now. I don't know if anybody here is working on marshes, but whatever you're working on, things take a long time. And this kind of work takes an even longer time. Like when sometimes people will falsely say, oh, social science, that's the soft science. Really? It's way easier to walk through a marsh with a quadrat and count plants than it is to organize a project like this. But you don't expect everyone to know how to do that. You still need the people measuring the marsh, the geologist measuring the sediment, but you also need the person, which some people call them boundary spanners, the person who is in there getting people together and making it easier for their work to transfer across the knowledges. So think about yourself and what you're going to be working on. And I ask you a question. Do you know someone who will be celebrating New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2099? So people in the room, raise your hand if you know someone who will be celebrating New Year's Eve, December 31st. Just based on normal life. Yeah. So when you think, oh my God, how long is it going to take? There are people alive right now who are going to be there on New Year's Eve. They're here right now. And our work is too important to not stick with it for the long haul and do the really hard thing. Because those people are going to be ringing in the next century and they're walking around right now. And there's people that need us to figure this out and use this kind of technique to bring the scientists together with the people that need their science so they don't have to wait 50 years. Thank you.
So just to remind you, Linda is going to help facilitate the discussion and draw upon things that are in the chat. I'm here in the room and I can handle questions. Linda, do you want to go first?
Sure. First, everyone, let's give Chris a hand. That was just the most amazing talk. So even if you're sitting in your room at home by yourself, clap, clap, clap. It just, we all, Chris, we learned so much. We learned things that we're going to think about, and it was exciting. It was a motivational talk, an informational talk, really wonderful. One of the questions in chat, it says, this is interesting, fascinating, and encouraging. Do you think that the reason why it has taken so long for a word like resilience to move from science to the public is because science is so siloed and political? In other words, scientists are usually not activists and often would prefer not to be.
Yeah, I think there's probably many reasons why it takes 50 years for concepts to move, but you know, scientists are doing such important work, and it's not like we want them to stop doing their work. Again, making the case that the silos have a benefit because you're in a discipline, you're in a field, because you know that field really well. And I learned about salt marshes and I knew that really well. So that when I got out into the other field, I had that knowledge that I learned from all the people who study marshes. So there's a benefit to both. And I think increasingly, just like with the science collaborative for the reserve system, having the structure that says, here's how you can do a better job of moving the science by devoting funding and grants. And the Mitchell Center and all the grants that come through here have this component, this knowledge to action component. So in the past 20 years, it's changed. You rarely see a paper now in the literature that doesn't have at least 5 authors from different disciplines. And I'm sure many of the folks in here, your majors are interdisciplinary majors, that you're studying things in a mixed way. When I was an undergrad in zoology, I wasn't even studying plants, it was just zoology. But at UNE, the environmental studies students are interdisciplinary. And I've noticed more and more scientists are coming in to the reserve system. They are already interdisciplinary. They totally get it. I used to have to talk people into things. It's like, yeah. Okay, when do we start? So I think things are really changing.
Your point is just such a good one. My PhD is in social psychology, and we were told we weren't to talk to anybody in social psychology who wasn't doing experiments. So your point is just such a great one in terms of how siloed we were and how difficult that then makes it to take on these wonderful problems that you're talking about. Another listener said, great presentation, Chris. Can you please discuss some of the geo/vegetative structures in the marsh, such as pans, and are you seeing shifts in these structures over time in your marshes?
Yeah, now that one I would have to refer that to Sue Adamovich at the Rachel Carson Refuge. The structures that you see in the marsh, that you might have seen in marshes in Maine, there's one that was just a table that the hay was put on. There'd be a series of holes in the marsh, and that's what the hay was stacked on. Some of the ditches that were used to drain the marsh actually had to be excavated to reveal them. So I refer persons that if you just Google farmers on the marsh, I think you can get to that paper. It's got excellent historical pictures and all over Maine. I mean, 1600s, 1700s, wasn't just mosquito ditches, it was agriculture. And that really opened my eyes hearing about that project. And we'll learn more as the project unfolds in state.
Suppose we had the opportunity, Chris, to follow you around. How might we be surprised to see what you do?
Yeah, you'd be surprised to see me sitting at my laptop all day long. And interacting with people is so much about working online and bringing people together. But as much as I can, if anyone, and this goes for everyone in this room, if you are ever near the Wells Reserve and you want to have a meeting with me, we will take a walk down the Barrier Beach Trail onto the beach and walk to the inlet and talk about some of the issues. So those meetings where we can really see what's happening, that trail looks way different than it looked on January 1st because the water literally just came across everything. So I would say it would be pretty boring unless you come to the reserve and we get to walk out and see these things. And it would be fun. Or if you come to a workshop, that's pretty exciting.
And David, I know you have questions.
Yeah, could I do one? Can you hear me?
Yeah, he says he'll take a turn.
Okay. And David, talk loud.
Okay, there's a question and I'll repeat it after you ask it.
Yeah, so last semester, there was a speaker whose name I'm trying to remember, but he does like select boards in Maine and grant applications. And the difficulties that he sometimes ran into with certain communities that they take federal money or that. So I know that there's a wide variety of social employee coast. So far you've only been in southern Maine, my understanding. If this project were to expand into, say, mid-coast or down east, how would you expect different barriers to that, or more or less the same kind of response? Folks there.
All right, so the question is about barriers that might exist where people don't want to engage with, with a federal grant, with different attitudes of, well, I don't want to go for that federal money to solve it. And we've done it in southern Maine, but would it be harder in mid-coast or further north? So it's an excellent question. And that Climate Ready Coast project, which was southern Maine, funded by federal money to help the communities. One thing we learned in that project is as we made these tools like the vulnerability assessment and the different things that people could use for resilience, it was really hard and a burden to the municipalities because they didn't have the staff that could then take those technical products and do anything with it. Now, that wasn't so much the barrier, like you said, with people not wanting federal money, but the difference with this project is even though we hope to benefit communities, the communities, I don't expect them to use this geologic tool to help their marshes. So the Marshes for Maine's future project is about training the professionals who will then go in communities that care about their marshes and they can help them protect it. So the federal money is coming to the practitioners, and then those practitioners, in the case of this team, every one of them was already engaged with communities. They're working with the Down East Salmon Federation, working in Northern Maine, Maine Coast Heritage Trust, working in Mid-Coast, Casco Bay Estuary Program. These are groups that already have relationships that are trusted with the towns. So the goal was to get this tool to those groups, and then the groups would take it to the communities. So it would be hard, like being an outsider, I'm here to help. But all of the people on that Marshes for Maine's future already have relationships with communities, and they're trusted and they've worked with them for a long time. That's the other benefit, the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. Even though we're partially funded by NOAA, we get these grants, we're there. We're there all the time. They know we're going to be there. We might help them with this project, but then we're still there. We're still there after the storm, and I'm constantly listening to people, thinking, what do they need? And then looking for the money to bring in to get them what they need. So that list of organizations already have kind of that hallmark trait if they have relationships. And I've had researchers that come to work with us say, I can't believe how you already have a community relationship and the science can flow through that long-term relationship. Does that answer the question at all?
Yeah, thank you.
Linda, I think we have time for one more if you've got one there.
Yeah. The one of the central themes, Chris, of your incredible talk was about learning from each other and transfer of knowledge. all the students in the room there, the others that are in the room, what can we do better in terms of transfer of knowledge, and learning from each other? What do we need to change?
Well, for all I know, you guys are the best communicators ever. But I guess the thing that popped into my head was about listening. And I know when I had my first job on Chincoteague, and I was gonna, this was junior year of college, and I was gonna be on a tour boat talking about the history of Chincoteague and aquaculture, not just the ponies. So before I started my tour, I went around to the aquaculture places and I talked to the people that were running them. I said, tell me about your operation. So then, again, I could tell other people about what they were doing. And it also takes a lot of stress off because you don't have to know everything. Even when I was preparing for this talk, if I was getting stressed, I said, no, I'm telling the story of my colleagues. It's not about me. And whenever you're in doubt, even if it's a high conflict thing, you're having a conversation, you stop and say, well, could you tell me more about that? I teach a course called Crucial Conversations, which teaches how to handle difficult conversations. And almost always, if you indicate that you want to listen, that you're curious and you want to learn, it's not about saying outward, it's about, and then when you hear it, you link that up to the science in your mind and go, I know how to reach this person because I know what they care about.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Perfect close, I think, just to hang on to that idea. It's taken me my whole life to get partway there, so you guys go ahead and start. Chris, thank you so much for a wonderful talk and for being such a great role model for all of us.